Unit 2. Your foundation stones. Identifying key stakeholders. Welcome. This is Victor Marromo speaking. Strategic planning and performance management consultant. The starting point for correctly identifying strategic factors and developing successful strategies is knowing who your key stakeholders are. Many organizations don't, and they busily work away, ever improving processes and wondering why success eludes them. Other organizations pay lip service to key stakeholders, but the real focus is customers, customers and more customers. Now, customers are key, but they're not the only key stakeholders. For example, Toyota and McDonald's recognize a diverse range of stakeholders and develop sharp and focused strategy for suppliers. They know that they can produce effective outcomes for their customers unless they first produce effective cost outcomes for suppliers. They also recognize that both of these key stakeholders depend on successful implementation of employee strategy. So, the starting point for correctly identifying strategic factors and developing successful strategies is knowing who your key stakeholders are. Key stakeholders are important because they provide resources to an organization or business unit through the transactions that take place between them and the organizations. The importance of strategic factors lies in the fact that they underpin these transactions. Transactions and key stakeholders. The arrows in figure 2.1 represent transactions, exchanges of something for something else. Customers receive goods and services, and in return, transmit money to an organization or business unit. Suppliers supply goods and services, and in return, they receive funds. The employees, which are a key stakeholder, put effort in an organization performance, and in return receive a salary and compensation. Owners supply funds, and in return, they expect dividends and company and capital growth. All organizations and business units can be analyzed in this way. Their purpose is to reap benefit from these relationships and the transactions therein. Take for instance the case of customers. While an organization naturally wishes to provide goods and services to customer specifications, it won't do it for nothing. In fact, one objective of that relationship is to obtain the maximum return to their organization from the supply of these goods and services. A clear grasp of the relationships between an organization and its stakeholders, and especially of the relevant transactions, will lead to a much sharper way of thinking about strategy. Success requires that strategy pays heed to the needs of all key stakeholders, because key stakeholders are sources of strategy. In developing strategy, we focus on key stakeholders. So, we define key stakeholders as organizations, business, business units and people or departments with whom an organization or business unit interacts and on whom it depends for success. Organizations and business units have a good number and variety of stakeholders, but there will emerge a core set who have a fundamental impact. Those are the key stakeholders. The following four examples of key stakeholders come from organizations that we have assisted or studied in their strategic planning. A private hospital have identified the key stakeholders as patients, specialists, staff, health funds, suppliers, general practitioners, parent organization. This private hospital recognizes the need to develop effective strategy for each of its key stakeholders, as well as to identify the relevant strategic factors. The strategic planning team of a public library have identified the following key stakeholders: state government as an owner, corporates, individual customers, donors and sponsors, staff, suppliers and contractors. Having identified the public library key stakeholders, the planning team then sought to understand the strategic factors relevant to each, with a view to developing effective strategy for each. Community support services. The community support services sees as its key stakeholders: owners, fund providers, employees, donors, volunteers, customers, the government as a regulator, and the government as service provider. As a regulator, the government expects community services to stay within the rules. As service provider, it expects it to use government services appropriately. Connectors. The Connectors company strategy and planning team identify a small group of key stakeholders. They are customers, suppliers, employees, and shareholders. On correctly identifying the strategic factors for each of these four key stakeholders, we can see that strategic planning is taking more shape and everything falls in more an organized way. We see from these examples is that the importance of correctly identifying the key stakeholders of any organization, private or public. This leads to a further identification that of strategic factors, which in turn leads to the development of a more effective and more in place and a more visualizable strategy. So, the whole process of developing strategy becomes more manageable when you break your organization's environment into identifiable key stakeholders. Key stakeholders are foundations. This unit has sought to demonstrate why key stakeholders are the base on which successful strategy is built. In the cases of the private hospital, the state library, the community support services, and the dynamic connectors. We saw lists of key stakeholders from a wide variety of industries. We noticed how they varied and how the descriptions are very industry specific. To bluntly label all stakeholders customers or group them under a general customer perspective or general stakeholders runs the risk of missing spatial differences between key and special point difference between key stakeholders. For example, look at the key stakeholders of the private hospital and notice their labels and their diversity. As the rest of this course will demonstrate, the whole process of developing strategy becomes more manageable when you break your organization and its environment into identifiable key stakeholders. Each can then be taken in turn and relevant strategy and more visualizable strategy developed. What strategic factors are and why their identification is so important is the subject of the next unit. Thank you for listening. See you in the next unit. Please send me your questions. I will be glad to answer them or discuss them. Thank you.